Good morning, everybody. This is Lauren Bobig, Director of the Office of Water Resources and Chair of the State Water Plan Task Force. Thanks for joining us here today. Really, our purpose is to begin to kind of dive into three topic areas for the State Water Plan today and have some general discussions and feedback related to that. And really at this point in development of the State Water Plan, we are at a point of transitioning from, a lot of us have been individually working on specific topics related to our fields of interest, but now is the time when we need to come back together and start to consider our recommendations in the plan as a task force. And so even though maybe your specialty might be, sediment and erosion, you need to voice in on recreation because it is part of the task force plan. So we as a task force will then collectively be beginning to look at these various recommendations and chapters, if you will, and then perhaps as we go forward, we'll be talking about some of these cross-cutting issues and the general format that we have for the report. And so with that, there won't be a detailed, PowerPoint walking us through a lot of what is on our agenda today, but really more of just this opportunity to begin to focus on some of these particular topic areas. And so I think today we have three of them, Wes?
Yes, 3 topics.
And so with that, I'll turn it over to Wes and or Brian to kick us off on that.
Okay, well, thank you all. As Lauren mentioned, we're going to be kind of going over the 3 topics, and what we really want to have this be an open discussion. As Lauren said, we're going to have Brian start off and just go over the aquatic and riparian habitat. So I'm going to have that queued up on the screen here in a moment as we get that underway. So you should be seeing that now. If you're not, please let us know. And then I will just turn it over to Brian if you want to just kind of walk through it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in the middle. However you want to kind of go through, Brian, we'll leave it to you, and we'll just kind of follow along on the screen.
Sure. Thanks, Wes. So I'll start just by saying kind of where our committee is in the process, because I think everyone's at a slightly different stage as we begin to meet here. Our committee finished what we might call our first draft of our section last year at about this time. I think it was about June. And based on our kind of comments and ideas of where our section should go, I did share that with a number of our stakeholder groups that were proposed by the IEC. So some of their comments and ideas are represented here as best I could. And then following that comment in our most recent public comment periods, again, trying to incorporate some of those comments in here, reformatted to fit the templates that was proposed by the task force. So that's kind of where we are here. I think what I'd like to do is if any of you, read this in detail and would like to make, very specific comments or edit suggestions, I'd love to just, get those as comments in the document. If you found any errors, those sorts of things. What I'd really like to focus on is 2 things. One, what did we miss? Again, from the perspective of your individual committees and just in general, did we miss something rather large? And 2, talk a little bit about the template itself and some thoughts I had when going through it and trying to match our section to the template. So I think I'll leave that discussion till a bit later. So, in the overview sections and the issue sections, what I tried to do first in the overview section was look at the previous documents, think very specifically about the recommendations that were in there, and then provide a bit of an update, if you will, on some of those. So, you know, for instance, they had some information about data and classifying strategies and those sorts of things for aquatic systems. And so tried to give a one-paragraph summary of the progress there. Talk a little bit about, you know, kind of the legal status, if you will, of water as it pertains to this particular critical issues. And so talk a little bit about statutes that govern this critical issue, and then, you know, again, later talk about how those kind of fall short for protecting aquatic and riparian habitat. So I would love to get your comments if you think there's something in there that I really missed. Again, the draft that we first produced was probably 2 or 3 times this size, so we really did have to cull that down into something much more reasonable. So obviously there are things missing, but if there's something that you think we should add because it's highly relevant, please let me know what we missed. In the issues section, then, I tried to think about not only what hadn't been completely solved since 1984, but then think about new issues that we kind of are arising. So the first paragraph is essentially about how you know, our waters don't quite meet our standard, right? Our goal of perfectly intact and resilient aquatic and riparian habitats, and talked about some numbers. So, you know, Wes and Lauren, as I was going through this, one of the things that kind of struck me is I don't know how specific to get and how general to be. So there's, you'll notice there's a lot of numbers in there, very specific about, you know, these measures and the metrics that are involved in grading and categorizing aquatic habitats. I don't know if that's appropriate or we should just generalize. So instead of saying 50% of streams don't meet their, you know, their use standard for aquatic biota, just saying most or something like that. So removing the numbers and just generalizing maybe would be a more appropriate. And I don't know which of those paths to take. I took a more specific path. And maybe as we go through all these critical issues, we realize that's not appropriate, or perhaps it's most appropriate. I don't know. It's easy to change it if we decide that this is too specific. The next chapter is essentially about data collection when assessing aquatic and riparian habitat. Again, what was there, but that we do relatively little. Despite all the effort we put into it, you know, there's very little data collection in terms relative to the amount of aquatic habitat that we have. And then finally, the third chapter then, or the third paragraph, and then the third issue is really about how Illinois water law prioritizes the private use rather than the protection of aquatic and riparian habitats, which is, to me, kind of a public use sort of thing. So the needle is certainly pointing in the private use direction. And certainly we have some mechanisms for protection under our statutes, but maybe they're a bit underutilized. So those were the 3, you know, big categorical issues. And then in the table, the issues table, tried to think about, you know, certainly those 3, but then, you know, did we have slight, you know, some sub-issues? And I think I came up with 5. Somebody pointed out I had a misnumber there. I forgot the number 4 in my issues. But tried to take those, you know, 4 or 5 big issues that I saw and make some recommendations, some very specific recommendations of how they might be fixed, so to speak, or at least make some progress. When I was doing this table, though, kind of, and I encourage you all to look through those and think about if they're appropriate, and again, if we can add any that makes this a little more thorough. I found 3 difficulties, though, especially with this part when I was going through. One dealt with the long-term versus short-term part of it. And I don't know if anybody else has thought about this. And one, I had a problem with, you know, problem visualizing what it meant. So did it mean when should we start that recommendation, you know, immediately versus in the near future? Was there a time frame on short versus long-term? I know we talked about maybe like 5 to 10 years or something like that. Which, you know, again, it seems a bit artificial to put a a definitive time frame on it. Did it mean, do we hope to accomplish this in the short term, but some of them in the long, would need a longer term and maybe not within the context of this, document, it would take longer than that? Did it mean that some could be wrapped up and some were continuous? I really wasn't for sure what short and long term meant. And so, if we choose to continue and define our recommendations within those terms, I think it would be great to define exactly what those mean so we can better categorize those.
Yeah, Brian, I'll just jump in here. I think we are planning, since we don't have a fourth topic today, I think the fourth part of this agenda is once we go through the three is that we'll maybe spend some time discussing some of these concerns. I know you mentioned and others have mentioned the short versus long term and how that may just add confusion or muddy the waters a little bit. Also, when it comes to the topics of funding and action, if those should be kind of a standard answer instead of kind of leaving it to whatever topic lead decides, those should maybe be a drop-down menu selection of, one of 4 or 5 options. And I think we'll kind of get to that. I think maybe for the topic discussions, we just may want to focus on the issue recommendation portion, and maybe once we get through all 3, we'll kind of maybe spend a little more time on the long-term, short-term, the funding and action section of this table to maybe make sure we're all on the same page of how we move that forward.
No, that's a great idea, Wes. So, that's all I really want to say in summarizing our section, and I'm sure as even our own internal committee members here take a look at it, we'll think of a few more things. But if you on the phone or in this room had a chance to look this over and saw some big holes in our issues and recommendations, I'd love to hear that either now or via email after the meeting as well. So I don't know what the best way of doing this, Wes, is.
I might just recommend maybe you just walk through each recommendation. If anybody has any comments or concerns of that recommendation, then, it'd be a good time to speak up and share. And hopefully we'll get some good feedback. And I guess, just looking at the first one, we may want to know as a task force kind of what that means more specifically, how that would be implemented. How would that be measured as we've completed this or we have not completed this?
Sure. Well, again, and that kind of goes to this kind of continuous thing. This is one of those recommendations that perhaps is never done unless we convert all land into something that's not degraded. But, this is something that we work for over entire careers and are never quite done with this sort of thing. So, any improvement is improvement, but there's no end goal. The more the merrier, is so to speak. So I don't know that I can answer when it's done so much as the goal here is to at least with the first one, for instance, we don't necessarily on our state-owned lands engage in best management practices for the benefit of aquatic and riparian habitats. We should be the leader as this agency, and so we should be, leading by example and implementing those, especially on our like ag lease sorts of lands and those sorts of places where we encourage or perhaps necessitate watershed best management practices on our land.
So I guess to me, as I was reading through that, on number 1, it kind of sounded like a recommendation to make a recommendation. And so I guess I wonder, the action is policy. Should it actually be implement this policy within the DNR as the agency responsible for this area that says, we're going to, deliberately implement best management practices on, some rate or some, some kind of metric. I mean, some of this comes because I've been asked to help review some of the department's policies and procedures, which I didn't even know some of them existed, but do we actually recommend a policy in the plan?
Yeah, maybe something that all new lease agreements must implement whatever the policy is that we're kind of moving towards, and anytime an agreement is renewed or a new one comes in, then we require them to follow this policy, or... Does anybody have any comments on the phone regarding the first one? And
well, I think maybe just a point of, let's just say that you come up with a good implementation statement that, DNR will do, implement BMP practices on, owned lands and leased lands, things of that nature. But a point of measure would then obviously be, what are the current acres under, what type of land management, and how many are converted to what type of thing. And that would be a measurement component, but I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but it just kind of came to my mind.
I guess I raised the question, and thank you, Brian, for giving me the vehicle to do that. Do we, within the plan, I guess it's how specific is it? Because that, it's really kind of a goal, I guess. When I look at number one, that is the goal to implement more, BMPs on state-owned leased lands. Or do we drop down more to that objective? Here's the objective, that by this policy, we're going to do X or Y, and so the state water plan could have, goal, I guess, level statements, or does it have more like implementable objective or strategies? And I guess I was leaning towards the strategy side as recommended strategies, and then we present that, and then that allows, you then to come in and say, well, we're moving forward on trying to not go forward with recommendation number one, in this manner.
yeah, so it's kind of, I think what you're saying, Lawrence, do we want to, in this recommendations, do we want to list our goals, do we want to list our objective, or do we want to list our tactic? So the objective is kind of, it can be measured, that the tactic is, how do we accomplish doing that? And I think that's a good discernment, that to make sure the report's consistent, we make sure we defining goals, objectives, or our tactic to accomplish the objective. I'm not sure if everybody kind of follows that, the verbiage used there, but it's kind of how I've heard it explained from time to time.
Well, is the objective the issue? I mean, it's sort of...
No, the objective addresses the issue, and it measures when it's complete. The tactic would be how you go about completing it. So the objective in this case, what I see is kind of the goal listed up here is implement these and improve. The objective may be have all new leasees under this starting in 2020, state fiscal year 2023, and as contracts get renewed, the percentage continues, so it gets implemented as they get. So that's the objective, and the tactic would be to develop this policy to have incorporated into our lease agreements so that it will incorporate the BMPs in the plan. That's just a quick shot from the hip, but you know, it's a question, do we want to have the objective just listed, or do we want to have the specific tactics needed to be completed to get there?
Well, I guess I fall on the objective side of things. If we get to a tactic or a strategy, we don't want to kind of set in stone too much of what needs to happen, you know, to do that.
That may be more of an implementation.
Yeah. You know, and so, but I guess, so I'm in between here, so this is kind of a goal, but maybe it's, develop a policy, you know, for new state-owned lands that requires these kinds of things in that policy, but it's not, here's the recommended policy. See the difference there, that, you know, instead of saying, well, we gotta have the final wording as the recommendation, it would be, we're gonna develop a specific policy that covers these components.
And Laura, does that kind of kind of address what you were recommending as well? You kind of mentioned about using like a land acreage, but I think it can be whatever matrix works out best. But is that kind of what you were addressing, Laura?
Yeah, kind of, but kind of going with what Lauren was saying too, is that may be a little too specific in that, like for this particular example, you know, if you get into a strategy, you're almost dictating to IDNR how they should be doing it rather than, you know, stating an objective and let DNR figure out how they want to implement that on their lands. And so, you know, monitoring acreage, you know, would, you know, be a way of measuring it. I'm kind of wondering, and I'm just tossing this out in the objective, do we want to be a little specific in that, do you want all, you know, state-owned, you know, lands implementing BMP practices by a certain time, or at least half, or just that they're, you know, continuing increase over the next, you know, 10 years. I'm not sure what a contract cycle would be and stuff, where at least half the acres have BMPs or something like that. I don't know if that is starting to get too specific, but you gotta, I don't know if we want to say anything just needs to continue to increase. I mean, we, you know, there might be some pushback on that and saying you're not being specific enough. But I think the acreage is something more in the leaving it up to in the policy to figure out how to measure it, and, you know, I like what Lauren was saying, is staying with more of an objective, you know, mixed in with a goal. I mean, the goal is to improve aquatic habitat, you know, and the objective is for, you know, state-owned lands to, you know, increase. I was trying to figure out some adjective to go with it. You know, lands implementing BMP practices, and then, yeah, then that policy would be set by the agencies and how they were going to do it.
Yeah, so the recommendation could be, you know, to implement water best management, you know, practices on state-owned and leased lands, and to prioritize those BMPs. The Department of Natural Resources should develop a policy that does. I mean, so you kind of could have both of them. You could start that statement with kind of the goal that's kind of identified there, and then go into will do X, or, you know, or will develop X. So it's not the developed X, but it's, the goal is to develop that policy, and that gets to that more specific, without necessarily, like I say, setting it in stone that here is the policy, and wow, now we can't change 2 words in it.
So I think
Well,
that's
yeah,
just a good.
and maybe a way to, you know, because I was trying to figure out, well, how do you, you know, increase, you know, BMP practices, you know, well, how much to what effect? And you might be able then to align that objective with the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategies or something like that as a goal of reduction. And then that leaves it open as to, how many acres and stuff of state-owned lands and leased lands need to be converted into BMPs, something like that. And that might be a way of at least overtly saying, we're going to, follow this guidance that everybody in the state has been, promising to look towards, something like that. And that way you can get around, well, how much is enough, in the goal, and then that can then be addressed in policy.
Yeah, I think that's it's kind of a mental note for all of us as we develop our recommendations, that we're kind of looking at that objective level, not a goal or a specific strategy to implement, but just looking at kind of a objective level for the recommendation. As a whole, I think this is a good recommendation. I'm curious, for DNR, we can look at this pretty easily and say yes, but I'm curious what other state agencies, because this says all state-owned and leased land. It doesn't say DNR-owned. So IDOT, Department of Ag, EPA, any other state agencies, do you guys look at this, and does that cause any concern if we would promote this as a recommendation that BMPs need to be on all state-owned land?
This is Brian Cox. I'm with IDPH now, but also used to be with EPA. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, and it was kind of touched on already, is that as state agencies, we should really be setting the bar for everyone else. And that's certainly, to me, I think that we need to be making sure that all state agencies or all state-run facilities and state lands, that these BMPs are being established on, regardless of if it's a DNR-run facility, it's an IDOT-run facility, if it's run by Department of Ag or some other facility. One other thing that I wanted to point out about the BMPs, that I think that would be good to just identify what the BMPs should be in consideration of. So should the BMPs be in consideration of like stormwater management, nutrient loss reduction? It's already identified with aquatic and riparian habitat. But to me, I think that to just say BMPs is incredibly broad. And I know from EPA's standpoint, when they're looking at BMPs, they're looking at pollution reduction. They're looking at stormwater management, that sort of thing. From IDPH's perspective, when we're looking at BMPs, we're looking at to make sure that whatever the management activities are not going to create some sort of public health issue. So typically some sort of contaminants or pollution. And so to me, I think it would make sense to add some sort of statement along those lines, what the BMPs should be established in consideration of.
So my answer to that is that, yes, should it be stormwater? Should it be, and the answer is yes, all of them. But, I think the reason for not identifying every potential BMP is that every land is going to be slightly different. And identifying which BMPs, and that's why we had, I put in the statement, prioritize the BMPs the greatest benefit. And there's no one specific one that's going to fit all of our land types. So you can think about a facility, they might be interested in stormwater management. Think about an ag lease land, and we might be talking about cover crops and riparian buffers. So it can vary greatly, but the idea is to identify what you can do and those that have the benefit. Also, I think one of the things to clarify a bit is that, we were careful to define aquatic and riparian habitat early on. People think of that as the physical. I think when we hear the word habitat, we think of the physical composition of the water. But that's very limiting. The chemical components also are part of the habitat, so, the water itself. So, those BMPs that impact things like nutrients or pollutants also improve or benefit aquatic and riparian habitat.
Yeah, and I guess to be clear, I'm not saying that we need to identify what the BMPs are. I'm saying what the BMPs should at least be in consideration of. And to me, to just broadly put it, aquatic and riparian habitat. I'm going to use like another example that I know EPA was dealing with shortly before I left, which was the intake structures at power plants, for instance. Because that's certainly an aquatic riparian habitat type of an issue when you're talking about intake of fish and the fish take that's occurring with those intake structures. And so that's something where if we're just saying that prioritize those BMPs with greatest benefit to aquatic and riparian habitat, there's some of these cross-cutting issues that if the BMP is only in consideration of aquatic and riparian habitat, there's other components of that are going to be disregarded. And so I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at when I'm saying that we should be identifying what those BMPs should be established in consideration of, and to just limit that to saying with the greatest benefit to aquatic and riparian habitat, that seems to be very singularly focused.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. You kind of hit on again, it becomes a cross-cutting issue, right? I mean, because we could have the same kind of a recommendation in the water quality section as well, or the sediment and erosion section as well. As we talk about expanding it to where, you're right, as state-owned properties, the state is the state, and so the state ought to be setting an example. Like Brian has said, well then that doesn't happen via a DNR policy, right? That would have to happen as like an executive order, where the governor would have to issue an executive order that says, hey, state agencies under my control, we will, do our best to implement these BMP measures on our properties as appropriate. It would take that kind of a level to be there, and then that provides that cross-cutting. But then that kind of brings in, we started to have that discussion earlier in our earlier meeting. So, we have many of these, and Laura, maybe you were already talking about this when I walked in about some of these cross-cutting issues, the way to address that. But, do we simply, maybe we have it in this section and, could reference or star it that, may also apply to the water quality and sediment erosion, topic issues as well. We certainly don't necessarily need recommendation number one happening 3 or 4 places in the plan at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's probably going to end up as we get through this and see how many cross-cutting issues that we have and stuff that, yeah, I think, kind of the cross-referencing, and then still some diagram that illustrates, the complexity of it too in the end type of stuff. So I think there's going to be probably a couple different ways of representing it. But yeah, I don't think the same issue should be appearing in the exact same one shouldn't be appearing the same one, and that maybe some people have an issue that's obviously a little more geared like towards erosion and sediment, but then it references with, aquatic and riparian habitat issue 1, or recommendation 1A or something like that. So people can go back and forth and read things so that they don't have to be word for word, but we've then identify that these have quite a bit of an overlap and deal with that. So ultimately, there might be a small list of them that we may want to pull out that they're so significant and so cross-cutting that we may have maybe a separate section where we do a narration of how they do cross-cut and complement and how many of these objectives could be achieved, through XYZ or something. But again, I like to keep it a little more organic to see how it all comes about and then see how we want to present it in its best light.
Yeah, I could almost see a cross-cutting table where you say this is cross-cutting. A includes recommendation 1A from section B, and you list all those recommendations that have overlap where you could effectively create one policy that needs 3 recommendations or something of that. And again, that's something that I think we'll need to continue to work out. I think these things are important, but I know we also want to get through all of Brian's recommendations as well. So I'll make a note to figure out how we want to address the cross-cutting. I know we're working on the diagram. I don't know if that's going to be, I think that will show the complexity of it, but I don't know if that will show how to clarify or bring clarity or how to implement these cross-cutting issues.
I think a diagram may be more of maybe taking some examples and showing in generally how the cross-cutting issues are fixing. So it could be more of an example illustration or something like that. So
Yeah.
again, I just since I brought up this whole thing about these discussions and collaboration and cross-cutting, I'm definitely taking a lot of notes and, we plan on, very heavily contributing, how to do this.
I like the idea of an example because it can get pretty complex pretty fast to where it's like, I don't know that I even want to look at that, quickly go over mine, but an example might help illustrate.
I guess, Brian, do we want to go ahead and move on? I don't know if we want to, looking at the interest of time and everything, if we want to kind of do more of a walkthrough. And
it's just that this first one helped us kind of vet some of these general discussions that we probably have.
Well, I think given, some of the comments regarding what a recommendation should be, it's easy to imagine that each of these will have to be adjusted slightly to be more formatted like an objective, perhaps with the tactic identified embedded in there a bit. So obviously each one of these will need fixing then. And I'm starting to envision how that might work.
Well, I think it's fine now. We can talk about them in kind of a goal mentality, knowing that they'll be kind of shifted to more of an objective base. But I think it's good to still go over them to make sure that everybody's still in agreement that that is something that we should have in the report. I think that's the primary concern, is that every agency or entity on the task force is in agreement that this is something we want to support as a whole. So.
Okay, sure, I'll just move on to the second one, and I think maybe just kind of discussing what my intent was at each one, I think is where we should go. So, 1.2 here is essentially the same as 1.1, but the emphasis is on private land. So here I was thinking specifically about something like the CREP program, where we have incentives for BMPs on private lands. There are others like, I'm going to get this wrong, the EPA program for non-point source pollution grants and those sorts of things also could be included here. But the idea is, and maybe some of you are familiar with the 30 by 30 program, where we want 30% of land protected in some way within the next 9 years. But to get there, we really need improvements in our incentive programs, more than likely. So that's what this one is focused at, increasing the number or quantity or area, or whatever you want to say, of private land BMPs. So similar to the first one, but again, emphasis on private lands here.
So there's currently a program in place for private land BMPs or not?
Yes.
Okay, so this would just be enhancing that program or improving it to provide incentives or?
So, I mean, and again, embedded in there is probably a monetary, a funding thing but also the education outreach program too, simply so people understand that the programs exist, that they've been expanded, that here's how you can utilize them, here's what you might do, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of getting to the strategy level of here's X dollars, or here's the outreach we'll do. So yeah.
Okay. The third one is really, I don't know if any of you have been involved in American Rivers project recently here in the state, where they've really tried to develop and get funding for these multi-benefit floodplains. And I think this idea has a lot of credit, where you look at these flood-prone areas, especially in these underserved communities that have, these major flood issues, and this can be urban or rural, doesn't matter, I didn't really designate either. But kind of redeveloping those places for multiple benefits. One is to reduce flood impacts on structures and people, and the second is to provide access to recreational opportunities. That doesn't necessarily have to be in the water itself, but you can think of green spaces and those sorts of things. So this kind of, I don't want to say piggybacks on that idea, but essentially says, there's a lot of credence in this idea of identifying these areas and then providing the funding and the mechanism by which we can develop these multi-benefit floodplains.
Now, I would just add, because I'm on the flood damage mitigation, we have that same recommendation.
Okay.
Might not be phrased exactly that way,
Sure.
but I know that we're talking about trying to look at underserved areas, and we've also been trying to look at more green development in floodplains. But we may have several recommendations that are separated, that don't tie it all together. So this is that cross-cutting. Do you not present it because I've got it, or do you present it and we tie each other together?
Yeah, I think that's what we talked at the last meeting, is that we still present it, but then we tie it together through some kind of summary table or something like that. My other thought is we could add a column as to what this cross-cuts with other recommendations of the report, something like that. But again, I think that could be a discussion for another meeting on how we show that relationship. But I think we still keep it listed as that we are showing someone who's interested in aquatic and riparian habitat may not go to the flood mitigation section. So that's why I think we landed on keeping it in each of the tables and then just denoting that in some way how these cross-cut.
I think redundancy is just fine. What we want to avoid is, we want them to concur as well. What we want to avoid is if they're not complementary.
Exactly.
So that will be kind of the big picture sort of thing as all of them are written.
I don't know who's going to be presenting the water-based recreation, but it seems like this could also be a cross-cutting issue with that, and whether, just changing the verbiage on that last sentence saying, reducing flood impacts and providing access to land and water recreational opportunities. I don't know. I don't think it's a bad idea to somewhat, wordsmith some of the recommendations, so it's more obvious about the cross-cutting issue or not. But it's just a suggestion. But whoever's doing water-based recreation can speak to themselves. But this just seems like an opportunity for a cross-cutting issue with that too.
Yeah, Wes and I got into this a number of years ago in the resiliency realm when we were going for a HUD, that HUD competition, and it's the idea here is this, killing multiple birds with one stone, to use that analogy. And so it's, kind of that, the plans to suggest that it is that goal to create multi-benefit opportunities, and so we were saying, if we create kind of an expanded storage area, could that also become a community amphitheater area or something, right? Do we add walking trails for the elderly into some project that we're doing, and trying to get all these other, if we're going to spend the state dollar, try to get as many program benefits for that dollar in that project as we can, you know, and so that hits on that. And so it really becomes with that providing, you know, multi-benefit goals to when a state dollar is spent.
Okay. Next one is really about dedicated funding for the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So I see a lot of overlap in that program and this critical issue. I think, you know, maybe being more specific with this one to make it more objective-like, because they have a lot of funding needs. I'm not entirely sure, and I know there is some legislation currently being passed around, if I'm correct, about doing this. I'm not for sure how broad it is in terms of, you know, what it supports, the various, you know, parts of it, because there's outreach part of it, there's the research part of it, there's, you know, the administration part of it, there's the monitoring part of it. All of those have their own funding needs. But this is, I think, it just reiterates the need for legislation to continuously support this. The next one's about, you know, reducing fragmentation with some specific items in there that might be feasible for doing so. And again, this is just about the flow of energy, materials, and biota, and trying to improve that. The next section, you know, about identifying Class 3 groundwater sites, if you will. It's a potentially a really powerful regulatory tool we have in our tool belt that is probably underutilized and mostly because those places just aren't identified. So part of this is the you know, the study by which we can identify these places and then enrolling them in this Class 3 groundwater protection designation, which not only, you know, potentially protects the water itself, where the groundwater Class 3 site is, but also then downstream areas as well.
Brian, I'll jump in here real quick. This is something I think maybe me and you need to sit down. We have in the water sustainability, I see this a great overlap, and make sure we're consistent on how we may implement this, is how to have sustainable groundwater aquifers and what that looks at. And I know one of our considerations was how much it contributes to base flow as far as what we look at for the shallow aquifers. So I think this is important. I never heard of this Class 3 groundwater designation or there being any regulation tied to it. So
somebody help me out. Is that in the Nature Preserves Act? Nobody knows. Okay, I'll have to look at that too. I have to get my statute book out and look specifically where it lies, but yeah. But
yeah, we agree in the water sustainability section. This is something that we need to look at and making sure that we're kind of on the same course as we have similar recommendations would be good.
Okay.
I have a question. When it's a one-time study, because we talked about studies versus long-term, but then from there, would there be a program related to this to make sure that people stay, or I'm just not following what happens after the study? Okay, so the study would be then to identify where these, so this requires, you know, hydrological modeling, you know, so you can identify upstream, you know, the flow of groundwater, its upstream source, those sorts of things. Then the designation itself is an actual, like, you know, statutory, it has statutory authority, protection, much like a nature preserve. Okay. So it really is designed to identify the source of groundwater for groundwater-fed natural areas. So you say, yeah, this is my spin that is, you know, a nature preserve, but just upstream of there is really the source of the groundwater for that fin, and therefore it requires protection as well. Okay.
So I think that recommendation would be for the study. The recommendation is for the study, but then there actually is a formal enrollment that is, you know, a formal enrollment procedure in which you say this is now protected under our Class 3 Groundwater Protection Act. And so it's not just a study to identify them, but then going the next step to actually enroll them for protection. It's, you know, think of it as analogous to a nature preserve. You can identify a place that is
great conservation value, but then you must enroll it as a nature preserve to actually protect it.
And the second half of that's already in place, right? There's a program.
There's already a program to do it.
So then, yeah, the recommendation would be to, in order to protect this, create this, conduct a study that does this to allow for better utilization of this program.
Yeah, I think we may already have the groundwater models. It may just be looking at whatever criteria makes it a class 3.
And say, is this class 3, is this different than what's identified within Title 35 of the Illinois Pollution, or of the Illinois Administrative Code? Or is that one of
that? I don't know where it lies in the administrative code.
Because under Title 35, 620, 230, they identify it as Class 3, which is special resource groundwater. And so I don't know if this is different than that or if that's one and the same. But if that's if it is different, then I would also make a recommendation to identify where that is designated as Class 3, just to distinguish the difference between how the different agencies are looking at it. And it might honestly be the same. I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Going back up, if I could go back up to the one before that about the fragmentation, would that be anywhere state dollars are spent we want to do that, or would that be create, legislate specific funding for that, or create a program for that?
So, I'll tell you what my understanding is of how it occurs now, which is piecemeal, and you know far more about dam removals and that sort of thing, but it seems to be piecemeal, as we can identify some amount of funding, it's slow because there's not a lot of funding. In other words, we can't do a lot of this very often. So, I guess to answer your question, I think it just, whatever we do now needs to be more robust. We have some of the pieces in place. It's just not a system that facilitates rapid identification and removal or rehabilitation of these structures. I don't know that we have any sort of levee removal or repositioning sort of program in the state, do we? I mean, I'm not aware of anything.
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Not yet. But we do have dam removal authority, dam removal fund. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that authority, we need to expand that authority such that it includes, fish ladders and bypasses or culvert.
And some of it can be simple design, and I don't know if we get opportunity to say something like review culvert installations, but if we were, we could comment on the design, control the design of such so that they didn't become perched, those sorts of things. And I don't know how we interact with IDOT on those sorts of things. Maybe they just do it without any interaction with the.
Well, maybe it's our OWR regulatory section, whenever they have a hydraulic structure, they evaluate it or at least consider if there's an impact to aquatic species, because that also goes through the CERT process anyways. So it may even be built into the CERT process.
But many of IDOT, we've delegated our authority to IDOT, so IDOT issues many of their own permits under that authority to say townships or counties or whoever. So it would be.
So there certainly could be some, but I think we might need to add IDOT to the agency list here as we're thinking about it. But there's regulatory,
right.
How do you want to call it? Enhanced regulatory review of these structures.
Shouldn't IEPA be identified too as a part of that, the reduced fragmentation portion?
You might have to elaborate on that. Sorry, Brian.
Well, just because they're partially responsible for those 401 certifications as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I know EPA usually doesn't get involved in the regulatory process of the dam removals because that all falls under the Corps' national the national permit. Nationwide permit, thank you, Lauren. So, I don't know if there's a way to get EPA directly involved in that or not.
Yeah, and so I'm not certain on that either, and so I'm just indicating that I think it would be wise to add them to that, since they are reviewing very similar certifications for very similar projects. So it would make sense to have them on there.
On this where it gets tricky when we talk about the table, we have this is the lead agency, and then do we have secondary agencies listed in parentheses just to make sure they remain included? But it's going to be somehow we have to decide how we want to represent that.
Well, if IDOT is doing a lot of their own permitting, then they need to be at least included in there. But you're right, including every agency that might be involved can make a long table.
Yeah, I think the idea is if we're looking for a status update on this in 3 years, who do we contact? And that's our lead agency. And they're responsible for pulling in EPA and other agencies. So I'd hesitate to try and put too much detail in a summary table kind of thing. So.
I would go to, I think, going back on the recommendation, if there's state dollars being expended, that they have to give consideration to that, right? So we're putting money into a new culvert for, Hamilton Township or something, that it has to give consideration to appropriate connectivity of the channel or something to that.
Okay. Good. Okay, so the next 3 issues are really related to the data resolution issue that I identify in the narrative section. And it's really about, these ideas that as we collect data on aquatic and physical, aquatic and riparian habitat, and this could be, physical measurements or, circuits like through the biota, that, we have 3 big problems. One is that it's a really coarse data resolution in space and time. 2, we have problems with certainly interagency, but even intra-agency communication between our various, storehouses of data. And then finally, we're a little bit limited in the assessment tools that we have right now for evaluating our aquatic and riparian habitat. So I separated those out into three categories here of issues. The first one, again, is the coarse data resolution. So these all deal with how we collect data, how we collect it over limited space and sometimes infrequently. So the first one there, 2.1, if you will, is really about increasing where we measure in reference to the stream gauges. So we have this huge stream gauge network. It's really focused on larger streams. So we're missing a lot of different types of aquatic habitats, and really focused on, primarily on flow with, a number of other measurements taken at some places. But we're missing a lot of very important data, as well there.
Brian,
Also,
this would be definitely a cross-cutting issue with the data management group.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because, we identified that, we're really needing more stations in smaller watersheds and in more rural areas as well, with longer term data collection. Now, as a group, we've steered away from water quality data and stuck with just stream flow data. But that's a future discussion, I think, about possibly adding some of these, physiochemical type of data in there. And I know at least BJ's on the line here. When I was coming up with recommendations, I emailed our committee and took liberty with actually recommending a stream data network collaborative so that, people from have different needs for stream gauging, meet regularly and talk about needs, and that, this need for, aquatic and riparian habitat, you get to see, well, where is everything, what's useful, what's not, and putting forward recommendations and see if people can collaborate or collaborate to find the funding to get, maybe a multi-objective, stations in and things like that. So definitely a big cross-cutting topic with that group.
Absolutely. And then the one below that is very similar, except the emphasis is on biological surveys. So again, biological surveys is limited scope, not necessarily representative of the waters we have. So improving the space and time, the spatial coverage and the frequency and time, also the breadth of the biota surveyed. So the emphasis tends to be on things like fishes and aquatic insects. Mussels are also very valuable, but infrequently sampled. And then, increase the frequency of biological surveys. So a lot of this, the biological stuff is based on IEPA's basin survey program. And, a lot of those stations are sampled once every 5 years, which is not not frequent enough to track trends.
So has that recommendation become change to once every 5 years to annual?
I mean, I think it could be, yeah. I mean,
Fund that.
the best designs for tracking trends in biota, a combination of, stationary sample sites that are frequently sampled, and then, randomly selected, but perhaps infrequently sampled areas as well. So, yes, this proportion of this would be improving the frequency, hopefully annually, of surveys at these kind of stationary sites.
So there would be some funding required, you say
Absolutely.
no, but yeah.
Yeah, that's give me more.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think any of these could include additional funding, right? If we had infinite money, we could do a lot of things. That we could use the existing staff, but redesign the program, and that's kind of what I had in mind here a little bit, that it was more about how we implement the current program rather than expanding it, but it certainly could be expanded as well.
I like that idea of a recommendation, redesign the program to do X for this benefit.
I don't know if EPA would like that, though. I mean, that's my recommendation. We may need to touch base with them a little bit as well, but they may say, no, we just need more money, then we can do whatever we want. But it's more, in my mind, it was more about prioritization of how the money is used. And then in the same, I identified DNR too. Certainly, this agency assists with that. So it's more about reallocating the current resources than it was acquiring. I hate to put it on every single one of these, just give us more funding and we can do it.
I hear ya.
The next part was expand the CTAP wetland monitoring. As far as I know, that is the only program in Illinois that really monitors wetlands to any sort of standardized methodology. And so this would be expanding that program, and then, which is a funding issue, but also using that program to periodically update the NWI, at least in Illinois, right? So this would be something that we could do that would benefit us and the federal program, of course. But, it's painful to know that a lot of times these NWI maps are decades old, and we use them for regulatory purposes. That should definitely be improved.
I think the recommendation would be then, I think I would focus it on that, the National Wetlands Inventory, to, recommend updates to that on a 5-year rotation or something.
Okay.
I know we've gotten, because there's been legislation introduced particularly as the Corps was backed away from their authority to manage wetlands. There were state legislative bills introduced to say, well, DNR should, be monitoring all of these unmapped wetland areas. Well, how do you do that? Do they say, well, Laura Kiefer, you own this farm and you want to now develop part of it, and so we're relying on your honesty to come forward and say, I want to have to mitigate these 10 acres because they're wetlands. They're just not, Laura's an upstanding person, but that just doesn't happen, and so unless you've already identified that, by another party that said, hey, there's wetlands here, and before anything can happen with them. And so I think that I would focus that really on a need to update the inventory on this kind of regular basis. Right.
Yeah, I'll go through these next few quickly, and again, I would like, your comments offline here, if at all possible. The next one is about controlling invasive species. I know it's an increase in funding. Really, the emphasis here is expanding what we're monitoring for. So much of it is, of course, focused on the Asian carp, but we have a lot of invasive species problems. And very limited funding to both identify where they are early on and then control them early on. But I may talk to fisheries a little bit more about this one if we're trying to get specific objectives here. Critical issue number 3 is again about this integration of data. So, our data are stored in very different, we have water quality data in one agency, biological data in another agency. They're very different formats. We have the technology now that these databases could communicate with one another, and so we could get real-time integration, and we should be doing that. So no expert on how to get that done, but I know it is possible, and that way agencies could share information as need be.
Through it. Illinois Water Resources Center.
There you go. We have one of those, right? It's across the street. Okay, and then the next two is just we've identified that there are limited tools for tracking trends and identifying the condition of our aquatic systems. One of them, the first one is just about identifying these environmental flow standards for public waters. I think we need to talk a little bit about this, Wes, in the water sustainability group as well. But the idea being, what should the flow look like in space and time to either enhance or at least maintain, our ecological systems here.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I guess one thing I've considered is developing a ARC map or something that the public can view so that they can see what low flow restrictions we may have, like on water withdrawal, on public water, so that, usually there's some big long process and they have to go into planning and they don't know ahead of time what restrictions water may have, where, the Kankakee is a high water system, so they may have a higher threshold than, say, the Des Plaines River or something like that that's lower water quality. So yeah, I agree, and we can definitely coordinate moving forward.
Right, and then again, and not only for today, but then incorporating climate change projections into those standards as well, so we understand that we're protecting biota into the future. And then the second one, what is 5, but should be 4.2, there is, we do have several biological indices that are well utilized and perhaps very powerful, but they're limited in their scope. So we do need some biological indices to track changes over time in our waters that represent the different types of waters, but also the different type of biota that are in there as well. So we do have these big assessment gaps that we just really need to fund the studies to fill.
To me, that's establish a standard. It would take a study to do that, but objective to me seems to be establish an improved standard to do X.
So that could be the second step, right? Which is, once you've developed the indices, use them to develop and enforce standards. Think about that a little bit more, how that should be. Okay. And then the last whole section here is all about this private versus public use of water. You know, again, some of it is just, you know, identifying additional waters that might fit the public water definition and adding those to the public water list. Again, it gives us some regulatory leverage to at least comment on some activities occurring in those. I don't know what your thoughts are on, you know, an OWR.
Yeah, I know Lauren probably has something, but I think there is a way to do that now.
Yes.
But I think you probably get 1,000 times more requests than what is practical, because the general public's understanding of how to petition or why to petition for public water is much different than what the state statute determines. And I guess I'll pass this to Lauren. This is one that to be honest, if I'd question saying we may not want in the state water plan, I'll defer to Lauren on this and Steve Altman as well, but I'd be a little concerned with what the outcome of this would be.
Right. So maybe it's nomenclature. What's your goal?
So really, yeah, that's a good question, Lauren. And really the goal here is that the public waters, that system, if you want to call it that program, whatever term you use, is one of the few ways that this agency has for commenting or regulating activities. We don't have a lot, say, like an ORC, that allows us to have any sort of say in what sort of activities occur in streams unless they have some other sort of designation. This is a designation that at least allows us to put our foot in the door and, you know, comment on, at the very least, activities that are occurring.
I'm going to suggest that the water plan recommend a new designation. Okay, because public waters now has very legalistic definition of what that is, and it's primarily related to navigability for interstate commercial commerce, and so and it relates accepted public uses, you know, that you can hunt, fish, swim, wade, you know, all these uses of that water that we regulate. I think what you're asking for is
we need something analogous of waters of the U.S. at the federal level.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. And so I think this is create that legislation or create that designation that's different than public waters. Because you'll never get that, because public water is tied to navigability, you know. And so if you want to be able to go up the, you know, Spoon River to some point, you know, where it's pretty small, you're going to need a different, you'll never be able to use public waters to do that.
Okay.
And so I would recommend here, rather than tying it to public waters, that it is a recommendation for the creation of a new designation, right? And so you could have, you know, public waters, we have an Appendix A. You could have your own Appendix B, you know, of streams in the state where for these, you know, reasons, we need to have some additional say. And just have that as, and maybe that's legislation then that does that. But I would strongly recommend not tying it to the public water list.
Oh, that's a great recommendation.
Yeah. Because we get that, and, you know, Steve will get into it when we get to his chapter, but it, you know, we get, especially lately, almost daily, you know, how come I want to be able to canoe on you know, on the Mazon River, I want to canoe on the, you know, the DuPage or the Kishwaukee and blah, blah, and we'll just state make that public. Well, we can't without being sued by every property owner along there. So I would say create this program, and you're really going to have to sell it as not taking away one of the sticks from the bundle of property ownership, but almost adding a stick that we want to improve your property or to, you know, preserve the beauty of your property. The state wants to add these designations or controls to prevent detriment to you landowner, you know, and so it's more of a giving instead of a taking. Because public waters, if we were to make something it really is a taking. So we get into, you know, like there's a difference too between public water and public use water. So you could get a number of people along a reach of river that says, you know what, we're open to allowing kayakers and canoers on our property from sun up to sundown on these months or something, right? And we'll give you that access, but nobody better be there after sunset. You know, we're going to go back to our waters, and nobody better be there. And so you can create that in an agreement without legislating that, and then that becomes kind of a public use as opposed to a public water. So,
okay. No, that's good. Reasonable alteration here. The next part is then, you know, we should have these ecologically based environmental flow standards that we've already developed in a previous recommendation, and then using them in the regulatory process for certain types of waters. We could change this public waters to whatever we, you know, decide this analogous system is in the previous recommendation. But the idea here is that we tend to, you know, I'll talk on the behalf of like ORC. We tend to regulate impacts to the organism itself, not necessarily the secondary impacts, things like water withdrawal and those sorts of things. So this is just about identifying that water is required to sustain these organisms, and that at least maintaining that minimum amount of water should be involved in our regulatory processes that already exist. So it's really about incorporating this information we get in the previous recommendation into these regulatory processes. The next one, so there are a lot of degrading activities that occur that we have no regulatory authority to, you know, even comment on or control in any way. And I've listed some of those sorts of things here. These can be extremely detrimental to aquatic and riparian habitat, yet we have no statutory authority to control them whatsoever. And so this is about fixing that loophole a little bit. You know, a lot of this is like, you know, the dredging. There's EPA only can control that if it's at least 300 feet, you know, so there's a big gap there that we have in regulatory. Clearing of riparian vegetation could be done by drainage districts without any sort of consideration of environmental impacts. So those extremely degrading actions are not controlled in any way. I could see in your eyes, maybe I'm stepping into a world that is going to be contentious.
Yeah. I can hear the Farm Bureau. That's what I can hear.
Well, the Farm Bureau can comment on this, right?
Right.
They have an opportunity too.
My only concern is that if we try to regulate everything, we will not be able to regulate anything, because you're just going to be swamped with every single little activity. And are we worried about every little minute, issue. You know, if you have a log fall across the stream and somebody wants to go in there with a chainsaw and cut it out, are we going to regulate that? Or are we really more concerned about, you know, somebody getting a backhoe out in the stream to do something on a much larger scale? I think there's a balance of when is something significant enough. I don't know if that's...
Well, this represents our wish list, right? And,
well, I'll also say, be careful what you ask for.
Sure, sure.
Because,
well, you brought up the example of you know, proposed legislation that DNR would somehow regulate these isolated wetlands. And, you know, we, you know, grimaced at that, at the idea that this, you know, additional effort would be, you know, thrust upon us without any sort of consideration of staffing or funding to get there. So I understand the concern, and so maybe many of these should not only be legislated, but I assumed, this is incorrect, but I assumed with any sort of legislative change or authority given that there would be a subsequent improvement in resources as well. That's not necessarily true. So maybe many of these need to identify that funding is required to pull it off as well.
Does this one wrap back up into the previous one about like the public water, where you had public waters? Is this more of where you would identify certain streams or those where you would want some say on some of this?
I think a lot of this is more about the activities. You know, to me, many of these actions, you know, they're not, you know, they're under a minimum size threshold, or they're granted by some other authority, yet they're no less impactful than many of the other things that we do regulate. So, you know, why may a drainage district clear the, you know, riparian vegetation for 50 feet in all direction without having, you know, any consideration for the impact and the resources that we regulate? You know, so they have this other authority that allows them to completely bypass something that, say, IDOT may not be able to come in and clear all the vegetation from their right-of-way, but a drainage district could.
So I just put in the chat a link to the Corps of Engineers Illinois Stream Mitigation Guidance that, you know, if, like you said, maybe, you know, clearing, or maybe somebody's trying to do something with a stream for their, you know, private benefit, that there's this process of, and we went back and forth with the Corps of Engineers about, you know, what is stream function and how you grade that and things like that. But I was wondering if that might be stepping into this realm as well. I appreciate the definitely appreciate the desire here, but it does impress me of kind of walking into a minefield of some of these other types of permitting and mitigation guidances and regulations. So I don't know, I'm just tossing that in as, you know, where does that come in this kind of process as well?
So I think, you know, again, my intent was here to fill regulatory gaps, not to be redundantly regulatory, if that makes sense. So if anything, if this is kept, and I'm feeling that the winds are blowing against this one, but if this was, you know, remains in it, perhaps some identification that this is really to fill, to regulate activities that don't follow under any other regulatory process, like many of these that I listed have. So again, we're not trying to say also regulate a dredging project that falls under the Corps of Engineers regulatory authority, but rather those very small dredging projects that don't meet the minimum threshold for, you know, IEPA or U.S. Corps of Engineers or any of those.
Yeah, and I'm going to push back from my program perspective, you know, that sometimes in our agreements, when we come in to do flood control, we demand that they clear vegetation and basically denudder of any habitat that might develop over time, you know, and so in the name of trying to convey water. And so I see, in fact, a policy, a department policy I'm looking at right now is there shall be no channelizations. Well, sometimes there must be channelizations if you're trying to get water out of businesses and homes, you know, and so I think that's what you're going to come up against is some of those conflicting.
Yeah, my concern is somebody's gonna look in this and say, oh, I gotta go get a permit to clear this debris. Well, I'm just gonna leave it then, because I don't wanna go through the permitting process and.
That'd be okay with the ORC.
That's what I'm saying. From your perspective,
But
that would be
recreation is not gonna like it because now you've cut off your ability to canoe that area. Water Resources isn't gonna like it because now you're gonna have a clogged bridge opening in a matter of years. So, you know, just because it falls in the river and creates good habitat doesn't mean it's best for everybody.
Which, I mean, again, I'm just you know, supporting our own,
Sure.
thing here, but which would make the regulatory process all that more important, right? So this is again, the item here is about reviewing, not necessarily stopping. But in the same way that we might review through the SWPTF process, IDOT trying to clear vegetation for a new road alignment or something like that, you know, we would review that for bat impacts and all these other sorts of things. We might do the same for a drainage district that wants to clear riparian vegetation. The opportunity is presented, not necessarily the prohibition. Opportunity to review, not necessarily.
Well, I think that you're gonna lose, you're gonna have, the Farm Bureau and drainage districts are all gonna go against this. I won't speak for Lauren, but if I was in Lauren's seat, I would say is OWR would go against this because it's going to be a detriment to communities maintaining their conveyance of their channels. I understand there could be an aquatic benefit, but we could start seeing communities getting increased flooding if they say, you know, well, if we have to go through this long review process just to go get a tree out of the channel that fell down during a windstorm, I know how I have to go through a 90-day review process. Well, forget it.
I was trying to think of how to spin that into a positive, you know, instead of a thou shalt not, how you could create something that would allow for.
And I'm just thinking if I was the homeowner that had a tree fall in my backyard that now fell across the creek.
I mean, I think it gets back to your collaboration that you were talking about in one of your earlier comments, that if you had opportunity to review, then you get all these conflicting discussions. Right now, that's not happening. So I hear what you're saying. How do you bring this topic into a way that you could communicate? I don't know what the compromise about the tree is, but there may be other issues that happen that would lend itself to a compromise where you don't take the whole thing out, or you, I don't know, but I hear the issue and I don't know the solution.
Well, I think I don't have the issue with the review process being enhanced. I think the bigger concern and the pushback would be where review is not required now, and now we're adding that burden to the general public. Now, I understand why you would want that. I think it's gonna, whenever it comes to big projects and big things, they're gonna say, yes, it's worth that effort to go through the review process, but something like, you know, removing sediment from a small channel that goes through a little creek that goes through a town. I understand there could be aquatic impacts, but, you know, they may just say, well, we're not gonna, it's gonna deter maintenance of a channel.
Would funding for like public education on like best management practices for these types of projects, would that be a type of compromise where you're not necessarily putting any sort of burden of regulation on, however you are educating the individuals that are making these or that are implementing these projects, educating them with the best management practices, which will ultimately or hopefully lead to a reduction of environmental impacts caused by that?
I was kind of thinking of something sort of along those lines, and that maybe the recommendation is there's a further discussion between all these agencies to come to an understanding that there's a need for this for aquatic habitat, health and habitat of aquatic species, and really maybe explore what could be done. Maybe really backing off on this and promoting the communication and exploration of possibilities.
We certainly have a new Cicada website that handles some of that that we're discussing here. What it comes down to, if I could just get drainage districts to stop some of these things and really think about their impacts, I'd be a lot more happy, but okay.
And so a lot of us try to avoid those drainage districts.
Yeah. I just wrote down OWR doesn't support, so we'll remove that one.
but with that in mind, though, about the drainage districts, I mean, is that a lack of education or just a lack of willingness on their part? It's
a difference in priorities. Really, streams are conveyance mechanisms rather than part of the landscape, and so there's really a complete polarization, I guess, if you will, of goals here.
And a fear of being regulated. I've been refused in at least one area to do just some minor monitoring in a drainage district, before and after they dredged, and they absolutely refused because they were afraid that information would be used to start regulating their activities.
Okay, so I think that's at least helpful for me, just to digest some of that.
What about a recommendation that what's come to light is there's a need for like exploring this further, right? You've identified that there is polarization. So maybe the recommendation is an effort to bring those parties together and see if there's, so maybe that's where the water plan should be, is more towards a process or a way to explore the issue further. Through my career, I mean, I've been in those, right? It's very much ag versus environmental with different objectives in life and goals. And it's just, the two aren't compatible, so it puts people at opposite ends. But is there a way to explore that, or a
Okay, I won't take any more time. Moving on quickly here. The next one's very specific here about a funding mechanism that Fisheries Division supports for with the goals of these things. So this is really getting this through state legislature. So there's a different that ORC is a revenue source that's not necessarily tied only to angling, that it can be for these other purposes. The next part is more fully utilizing the NERDA process. And so really what we're going for here is our NERDA process is a little bit clunky, difficult to use, and doesn't necessarily always result in replacing the resources that were damaged. And so taking the handcuffs off, so to speak, of our NERDA program here, and allowing them to more fully utilize the statute.
Brian, if you don't mind, I'm going to step back one, and you talk about establishing an aquatic habitat stamp. Who would need that, or how would that be?
So I'll be honest with you that this is already in process. So this is just a reconfirmation, I think, of something that's already going on, and this is a statutory change, right? Statutory and corresponding ad rule change that's already been proposed by ORC to our, legislative liaisons, and hopefully, if not in the next year or so, in the near future, will be good. Are any of our fisheries division people on from the recreation group?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
Brennan and Seth here.
Yes,
Okay,
we are.
so can you guys give us an update on the status of that statute change?
So the stamp that I know about is, I thought it was aquatic nuisance species stamp, an ANS stamp. I haven't heard of an aquatic habitat stamp. And I don't know where that is at, but maybe they have changed it. But the last I heard, they were trying to go for an ANS stamp to help with invasive species and Asian carp control, because all of our funding goes through the federal government for that. We have no Illinois funding for that. So I'd have to look into it and find out more information on aquatic habitat stamp.
So I hope you will look into that, and the reason I say, so I was I helped review that statutory change. I believe that the at least initial name, now this could have changed, so I'm hoping you'll check up on that, was aquatic habitat stamp, and the idea was exactly what you said. So it could be used for these things that I list here broadly, but also, because of the way the statute was written, should the aquatic nuisance funding ever be eliminated from the federal government, it could also be used to replace that funding. So, I mean, its intended purpose is for these things that I've listed, but also had a secondary purpose should federal funding ever evaporate. But its initial name was the aquatic habitat stamp. So that may have changed.
And this is a stamp that would be required in addition to your, like if you had got a fishing license,
Yep.
you would also have.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a good point, though. I should be specific there. And
So this is something that's required anytime you get a fishing license?
Yes.
You also need a
Yes.
aquatic habitat.
and so it was like $5 or something like that that would be put on there. You could buy your trout stamp and your salmon stamp also, but this would be a permanent and required.
It would be a
Addition.
required stamp, not an addition.
And the reason for having a stamp rather than just increasing the fee associated with the license was that it was going into a dedicated fund for these purposes. So the license fee goes to the game fish. This was other things fisheries needed to fund as well. But it can be used for these things that are closely, aligned with the aquatic riparian habitat ideal goals stated in the water plan. So again, the wheels are already turning here. It's more of a reaffirmation that this is important and can benefit the state water plan by protecting enhancement aquatic resources.
Okay, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And then the last part here is just the recognition that throughout much of the state, isolated wetlands are not protected, and that that's kind of again a regulatory loophole, if you will, given their importance to our waters of the state. And so we need something that is kind of analogous to what many of the Chicago area counties do or have, which is protection of isolated wetlands. But we need that at a statewide scale rather than a county by county sort of regulatory mechanism that we have.
Does that tie into your previous NWI?
It could, yeah. I mean, all those things are absolutely related. Knowing where they are is one thing, right? But for the most part, 90% or more of our states, they enjoy no regulatory protection. And exactly what that legislation would look like, I don't know. It could be crafted out to the collar counties that have well-developed regulations, but the idea here is that those are protected, that those have no protection.
Okay, very good. Does anybody have any closing comments as it regards to the aquatic habitat section?
It's a good one to start with, because Brian, you've done a nice job
Yeah.
of putting together a lot of the stuff here.
All right.
One next.
Hearing none, we'll move on to recreation. I think Brennan or Seth, or either of you guys on to?
Yep, this is Brennan Caputo. I'm on.
Very good. We'll turn the floor over to you. We have your document kind of pulled over, and we'll try and follow along as you kind of give us an overview and go into the recommendations.
Okay, I'll try to go over this a little quickly. Overview is basically, we got this from the state recreation plan. Just basically given the numbers of rivers and inland lakes. Our issues never really changed. We didn't get a whole lot of feedback from the public and email, and what we did, we kind of added into one of our issues. We didn't have any issues with invasive species or access. Couple comments were about safety. And a lot of comments were about private waters versus public waters, and we kind of integrated that into awareness. So our issues statement on the first page just basically goes over our recommendations and a little bit of detail about it. So then we go to our table. We had kind of the similar situation that Brian was talking about, short-term versus long-term. A lot of our recommendations is stuff that's already happening. So, and it would be continuous. So we don't really know where to put a short-term goal versus a long-term goal. So we kind of just combined them and put them as short and long-term goals. If we go into more detail about kind of what we're wanting here, we can change this. But our first one is invasive species, and this is kind of what Brian was talking about. Also, there's a little bit of cross-cutting there with his. We're looking at Asian carp removal being a big one in terms of impeding recreation. We already get funding for upstream Illinois River, but really that's the majority of where the funding was going. And I'm going to have to look into the aquatic habitat stamp, and that could be used for invasive species. Like I said, I thought that was initially called an ANS stamp, so they might have changed it. I'm not sure. And then that would be a source for invasive species, and that's currently in legislation right now. So maybe that could be a short-term goal, but it's also a long-term goal also. So we're back to that.
Let me ask the question, how do other states, do we know how other states are dealing with that? I mean, we're all, especially those in the Great Lakes, that are Great Lakes states, we're getting the GLRI dollars to do a lot of that right now, but how are other states?
So other states are getting funding from the federal government too, just not as much. especially Illinois is getting the top amount. Kentucky has done something to where they make it more of a tournament style. They have a specific set of dollars and they bring in commercial fishermen to try to make it like a tournament with earnings to get rid of Asian carp. That's kind of where they're at. Wisconsin does, they charge for parks. And so because they get that kind of funding, they can do power washing at ramps and stuff like that to help with that kind of A&S problems in terms of plants and that kind of stuff. So really there's multiple different funding sources along those lines. And I think if the aquatic habitat stamp or the A&S stamp, whatever we're calling it, if that gets passed, that could be a funding source and it could provide some of this much needed funding for these areas.
We're talking about, to me, we're talking about basically the creation of a invasive species program. I mean, the stamp provides a vehicle to fund that, perhaps as another recommendation, but we're really wanting an invasive species program established, or do we not, is that not already a subset of fisheries?
We have an A&S program, but it's mostly funded around Asian carp in the upper Illinois River.
Right, federally, right? And so
yes,
would the recommendation be to create a state program to supplement, federal resources that are provided?
Yeah. So if we had a state funding source, it could be a statewide A&S program instead of just an Asian carp upper Illinois program.
Is there
And it would be multiple species, not just one species. It would cover all invasive species.
Understood.
Or potentially could. Any questions or comments on invasive species?
Well, it sounds like if we're shifting to a more objective-oriented recommendation rather than goal, you'd want to include those specifics.
Yeah.
Identify state funding to enhance the scale of the existing aquatic species to include additional areas of the state where invasive species pose recreational hazards, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you're right, yeah.
So it's adding all the details that you just told us, Brandon.
Yeah, I didn't, when we created this, we didn't know how specific we were wanting to go. So we kind of left these a little bit broader, but we can definitely go more specific on these.
I think so, because what you've got here is kind of our goals. They're good. So take the goal and add to it with more of the objective, an actionable item.
Yep.
Number 2, I want to give you a more specific. So we are engaged in the Brandon Road, project for aquatic invasive species, or invasive carp there. What I want to do is create an outreach and education center at that site that deals with invasive species, not just invasive carp, but invasive species across the board. But to me, we're going to have state-owned land. We're going to have a $1 billion project focused on what's the whole purpose to deal with invasive species. So I want to create an education center as part of that project to raise that awareness. So I would add that, almost that specific in there. I'm pushing that from our involvement in that project, because the federal authority that comes with that project includes outreach and education. So I'm trying to tell the Corps, I want more than a website and flyers, you know, or signage. I want a destination that, you know, a visitor center or you know, something you can go to that is that Center for Research and Education of Invasive Species, that site. That would be my ask as more of a specific to recommend the creation of that, of a invasive species education and research center or something.
So are you talking about funding, or are you talking about kind of under the awareness category underneath in 5 through 7, kind of like the awareness of invasive species, or are you talking like a funding specifically for that project?
Yes. it would be a, you know, like we have, kind of thinking down like on the cache, right? We have a visitor center that is focused on wetlands and wetland awareness. Do we have a center that focuses on invasive species awareness? And so that would be a specific funding and action. It helps me drive what I'm trying to accomplish through a federal project. And at some point, the federal government may push back and say, well, we'll do a little bit, but you're talking about a betterment to our structural project. But if we had in the water plan that we want to create this center, then we use that again as another means to go for specific funding, project funding to create that.
Okay.
And I can certainly work with you further on some wording or what we want to do there, but that's a specific that I wouldn't mind having in this, you know, a 5-year focus, particularly on that issue. We're gonna,
yeah, and I can work with Kevin Irons because he's more familiar with the funding status on ANS.
Right. I've already reached out to him and Chris earlier this week about exactly that. Who do we collaborate with? How do we? I need a proposal, basically, to take to the federal government. So Kevin,
okay.
So the ball is already rolling. So if you can join in on that, that would be great.
Okay. Anything else on invasive species? Okay, moving on to number 3, access. Access is always going to be an issue. Continuing request funding from State and Wildlife and Parks boat improvements. We reached out to Lands and they have really said that funding is more the issue than access. So that's a continuation of the park improvement that's already going on.
So with the objective here, just trying to read into what you said, be something about identifying those infrastructure needs, and then, so the funding, who's the funding coming from? I'm not clear on this process.
So the boat ramps, I think the funding for a lot of the boat ramps comes from state and wildlife, but I don't know if that's specifically for just the boat ramp. So then the parking lot would be state. I'd have to reach out to Lansing and get specifics on what the funding actually goes for and what it doesn't go for.
So this is really an expanded funding? Is that what I'm getting? To meet the needs of the.
Yeah, whether it be introducing more access or just maintaining the access that we already have.
I want to spin this, and we didn't really get into it in the previous issue. So in all cases, we need to try to weave in social and environmental justice issues. Can we, in this way, you know, you know, so boat ramps and some of that stuff, that allows for those folks that are fishing for sustenance instead of just sport to have better access to the water in a fishing environment. Can we in some way also put a spin on that to, you know, to improve access for, you know, disadvantaged fishing sustainability needs, you know, have more boat ramps or access sites. I want to somehow kind of spin it in that way that these actions, these needs also serve those disadvantaged. That's at the top of my mind because going back to that Brandon Road project, I'm trying to do specifically that there, that, you know, we got a project that we're going to take a piece of public water and make restricted. And right now that's all, you know, that's public water for hunting and fishing and boating and everything. And so how do I mitigate that under public water law? And I'm suggesting that we take the river side of that divider island up there and enhance it, create a public boat ramp, create a public, you know, parking and fishing area, because I have seen people fishing there and I don't believe they're fishing for recreation. And so from that social environmental justice perspective, we best not in that project take away from that. We should in fact enhance. So kind of building on that.
So Brendan, can either of these funds be used for shoreline fishing access improvements, especially like, you know, accessible sorts of improvements? You know, I'm thinking of, you know, Riverwalk style improvements that would allow greater access to these recreational opportunities for shore.
Seth Love here. Oh, sorry, Brendan.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to step in real quick. So the idea with the first point, continuing to request funding for state fish and wildlife area and parks. I don't know. I don't believe that one would be the most appropriate place for including socially disadvantaged individuals or groups. So my area that I cover, Will, Kendall, Kankakee, and Grundy County. Most of Will and Kankakee County is pretty urban, and I think the fourth point, where local governments are using the BAD program, would be probably the most appropriate place, because a lot of, you know, county forest preserve groups have a lot of ponds and lakes where people fish and boat and canoe. So I think the fourth point would probably be the most appropriate place to include that language.
Well, yeah, how could you wordsmith that to really put a spotlight on to serve the disadvantaged? We want to enhance this program or expand this program. You will get environmental groups coming out of the woodwork to support that if it's spun that way. And the governor's office is looking for us to spin this plan that way as much as possible, where it fits. So somewhere in these, I see that fitting, right? With a deliberate mention of to provide access, sustainability kind of, food sustainability, access to public waters. We need to have funding and a program that helps the state help those people, right? And so instead of having to crawl through the woods and, over the brush pile or whatever to get to fish there, it should be, easy and accessible and convenient. And so somewhere in there, guys, I think I'd like to have it spun that way.
Definitely, yeah. And to Brian's point, I think a lot of the funds for boat access improvements, at least on like state parks or state fish and wildlife areas, whether it be boat access improvements, ramps, paving roads, because a lot of our state sites, they're gravel roads. I think a lot of that may come from parts of the general fund, but again, like Brian said, we'd have to look into it.
Yeah, if we could. I want to get because you could easily get to a Thurston and Buffy kind of going to North Quay Marina to board their yacht, kind of a perspective of boat ramps and so forth. And I want to go to the other extreme and saying we need resources for the poor people who are fishing for their evening meal, or trying to, or because that's their vacation, is getting to go to the river, politically, and just that's kind of where I think this administration's at and the way of the world. So as much as we can spin it to that perspective, we're going to have success and it's going to be accepted.
Seth, I just have a comment kind of aside from the current discussion, but I noticed on this that you guys had the lead agency as the local government. And I guess my recommendation, and others can disagree, that we may want to, since this is the state water plan, we may want to adjust this to, well, what is the state agency doing? Are we promoting local governments to participate in the BED program or something like that? Because I think the focus should be on state agencies and state entities. That's just my 2 cents. I don't know if anybody else agrees or disagrees, but I just wanted to throw that out there for consistency throughout the whole report.
Thanks, Wes. Yeah, no, that's a complete good point. In the back of my mind, that's kind of what I was thinking, but yes, it could be a state agency as the lead, because ultimately, the local governments have to apply for the program because there's limited funding, but totally, a state agency could be the lead on that.
Okay. So, I mean, so your objective here to bring all of these things together, we've been talking about the 5 minutes, it could be something like, DNR partner with, park or conservation districts to identify places where recreational fishing access is in high demand, and work with those agencies to apply for and secure funds for access improvements, especially in underserved community. So those sorts of things could all be brought together in a single recommendation. And I think, if you've worked with local government entities long enough, many of them have staffing difficulties where even applying for funds can be very difficult for them. They don't understand the process, so they don't have the people. So the state agency role in here could be the assisting part.
That's a great point. So.
Yep, and I mean, a lot of us already have co-op agreements, cooperative fisheries management agreements with a lot of cities and counties and stuff. So, so it's easier for us to kind of understand where those disadvantaged groups are and that sort of thing.
Great.
Anything else on access?
So one thing I didn't see, I keep hitting that, sorry guys. One thing I didn't see in this chapter and in the access part was a discussion on, we'll just call it water volume or water availability. And so what I'm thinking here is as we have continued strain on our water resources and perhaps conflicting uses, is that in order to maintain recreation, we have to maintain a certain volume of water. And I don't mean that, perhaps very quantitatively, but you can imagine in places where other uses could, severely strain the water resource. And so you limit then, or perhaps completely prohibit angling or boating or any of these other sorts of recreational opportunities. So in my mind, one of the access things is ensuring adequate water so that these recreation opportunities can continue. We don't want someone putting a giant straw in the Kankakee River and drawing it down to the point where you can't boat it any longer, or whatever the case may be. And so just this identification that recreation takes water, I mean, it seems absolutely intuitive. But again, when we have completing roles for the water, recreation, could be deprioritized. And we want to ensure that at the very least is recognized as a use for the water when we're thinking about its use.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's cross-cutting to the kind of the low flow regime requirements, right? I mean, as Wes lives with every day, we can't put more water into the Fox Channel Lakes unless it rains. And people think that we have that control, or if they can't boat, it's our fault because we haven't put more water in there. But so we can't control the amount of water that gets to the streams or lakes, but we can control conceivably how low we let it get.
I mean, perhaps a better example would be, the lower Kaskaskia River, the high recreation area. We have a lot of control because it's a heavily regulated river with the Corps of Engineers dams. As part of the Corps of Engineers, management procedure, consideration of maintaining water levels in that channel might occur. You're smiling because it's the Corps, I know, but those sorts of examples where we do regulate heavily or manage heavily, maintenance for recreation should be a consideration.
Yeah, we could certainly add that in. I know a lot of times recreation is on the back burner in terms of water resource, because a lot of times it's more an issue for flooding and that kind of stuff to make sure farmland and stuff like that, where I don't really think that recreation will be moved higher up on the priority list, but I'm assuming some areas can be. So I definitely think adding that in to access would be a positive for this.
Lauren, I don't have to see your whole face to see your reactions talking about the Corps. So.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would add about your access, you keep saying that and I know you're gonna be changing these, but that their funding's established, and the fourth item, that they already have the bad program, but I think you wanna definitely add that they wanna enhance funding for those programs to allow more people to get access to those types of programs. So just make sure you include enhance, because when I read this, and I know, again, this is, we haven't decided what to put in those columns, I read it as just continue as is, but I think you want to enhance.
Well, I'd like to enhance all of them.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know, we're gonna promote a bad program? This just doesn't sound.
so, yeah, I mean, we can change established to enhance on all of them, because all of these would be better off with additional funding.
So going down to number 5 into awareness, I want to continue promoting Illinois water recreation opportunities by ... Me, we need a how, or does that create
Well, yeah, I think,
more videos, more commercials on TV to come recreate? Is that creating more trail? I don't know.
something that's measurable.
Yeah.
To say that we can know whether or not this recommendation was completed.
Yeah, that's a good goal. That's a goal to promote water recreation opportunities, and so the objective would be by doing this.
Yeah, like I said, we went a little bit broader with our recommendations, assuming that if this went forward, a committee would go into more depth about this. We can certainly go more specific with these. I mean, you could go a lot of ways with promoting, and we have reached out to the people that do promote, and they are open ears for other ways to try to promote our water. So we can definitely go more detail with this.
Yep, I think some objective there would be good to add in. Because then when you carry that out, from your program perspective, then you can simply refer to, well, we're gonna, we're trying to now implement or carry out recommendation number 5, right?
Okay. Number 6, this is one of our cross-cutting. This one we had a lot of feedback from the public about private versus public waters. And we have reached out to Steve, and we'll have to go in more detail about this with laws and regulations. With talking to him, it would have to be not really legislation, but deal with courts to try to change that. But I think on our end, this could be fit under awareness to let people know where you can go, where you can't go, and just the general laws in water recreation.
Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and again, I'm a fan of the GIS products. If you're somewhere on your boat, you can go and pull something up, or at your house, and see this water is public. That means I can go and do this, this, and this on it. This is owned by a government entity, therefore I can go do this, this, and this. And kind of that classification that Lauren was talking about, coming up with a classification system on, this is private, you cannot go through here. This is public water, and that's what this means, and maybe it's a government owned, or maybe there's other classifications, or a push to create a new classification. But I think this is something that we could easily shared to the public and they could easily locate where they're interested in and figure out what they can and cannot do.
I think that's a good point. I think we do need some outreach. I can tell you that in the last couple months, I feel like I have something come up with regard to communities thinking a body of water is public and it is not, and finding all kinds of information on the web that is incorrect, and it's creating some issues. We've had, obviously DuPage River has been a big item in the news, but we ran into a similar case on Nippersink Creek when they had all of this all this documents on the website talking up recreation on Nippersink Creek, and the county actually had an issue with one of the vendors that was running a canoe operation, and they were, they was violated they were trying to determine whether or not it violated their zoning code. And when I looked on the county website, where they were doing recreation, 60% of the water was privately owned. So, we just happened upon that on accident because of another issue. So I do think that identifying areas where people can recreate and having a better understand of public bodies of water, I think, is something that we really do need right now.
But I think it gets complicated too, because you get people from other states coming in and bringing their understanding of what that state has decided as public and private, and then come to Illinois and vice versa. So yeah, I think, this is a great idea.
Seth and Brennan, I envision, I like what Wes is talking about, the GIS-based sort of thing. I envision something on your iFish website that people can pull up on their phones. Not only does it identify things like public versus private, or this is state-owned, but you could link fishing regulations to that as well. So one-click sort of thing, and so there's a lot of opportunities here, but I mean, if you can find a way to synthesize what you're talking about here, I'd love to see it too, because I still struggle with these sorts of questions.
Yeah, and there may be existing resources out there where there's a statewide, fishing report, and here's where things are going. I obviously don't know much about this, it's you guys, but if there's other state resources already available where you could just share this data or incorporate this data into an existing app or something, just getting that information out there somehow would be beneficial. Not saying we have to create something new as far as a product, maybe it's just incorporating it into something that already exists.
As far as fishing goes, we don't have any type of GIS product available. In our mind, it would be awesome if there was something like, I think it's called IRAP for hunting, where there's this map where hunters can look and see which land is public, which is private, which is private, but there's an agreement so that they can hunt on it. That would be ideal. But there's currently, we, on our iFish page, you could, an angler can go and type in Braidwood Lake or Heidecke Lake and find, the previous year's data from the survey, regs, that sort of thing. But we don't have a really, glitzy, fancy, showy, intuitive software platform for that right now.
So to me, that becomes a recommendation. That is, what you just described is a great recommendation for the plan. Create this thing to allow that to happen.
And try to work with communities and park districts to kind of see what is in their ownership, as well as also including everything that is in state ownership, specifically in state parks, and then maybe provide contact information to see if you can recreate on that particular piece of property or particular water.
you know, and this is a huge issue right now, right? Because even though it might be publicly owned, right? It could be a nature preserve or something that owns it, but that doesn't mean that that nature preserve is going to let you hunt or fish or canoe on that water. You know, I look out the window here and we have a nice pond right outside of the DNR building. That's a public pond, but we don't allow fishing in it, you know? So I think it's a great issue to try to better educate and define, because here we're, you know, from your perspective, you know, Brian, we're trying to promote hunting and canoeing and kayaking, but yet at the same time we're saying, oh yeah, but by the way, you can't do that on 90% of the water in the state of Illinois, right? You know, so it's a huge need. If we can't change, to at least educate or help promote where we can. You know, and you mentioned kind of the IRAP or whatever that program is. I've had that idea too, and talked to legal about that, of how perhaps we, the DNR, we, the state, should provide an incentive program, because right now, you know, people want to canoe down the DuPage River. Well, guess what? You probably can't really, because so much of that is in private ownership. Okay, well, but you could if you got an easement from, you know, from this property owner or that property owner. But we don't give those recreation groups any tools. So what if we had a tool? What if the state offered some sort of an incentive program, a tax cut, or, you know, a lease kind of a thing, that now the Illinois Paddling Council can go forward and say, yeah, we want to create a trail from point A to point B, and we've got 37 private property owners. We got to get their all 37 signatures to do that. What can we offer them that encourages them to sign a piece of paper that would allow that? Right now, there's nothing there other than please let us do that. But if there was some incentive for that owner to offset the fact that they might have to pick up a couple of beer cans and, you know, on their property or something, then we've got something. So to me, I wouldn't mind seeing that as a recommendation in the plan, to create some sort of an incentive program that helps promote. If we can't make it a public water, can we at least provide an opportunity to try and make it a public use water via agreement, where the property owner has some incentive to do that?
And to add on to that, I think that, you know, given some of the, you know, legislative interest in some of this is something that we should obviously we're going to be putting this in the plan, but it's just like, you know, behind the scenes, or, you know, in our day to day, if we're intersecting with a lot of legislators on this, you know, this is something we definitely need to tell them, that it's like, you're not alone with this issue. You know, just legislating to say it's a public water really isn't a viable solution, but there are other things that you could do that could put some funding so that we can recreate on these streams, and looking at ways to incentivize the property owners that, you know, they would allow something like this. I think that would be great.
Yeah, I know other states, they do something similar for fishing access. In New York State, they purchase, I believe the state purchases fishing rights along streams that may, you know, if a farmer owns a field adjacent to a stream, they purchase X amount of feet to allow shore fishing. So yeah, it's being done in other states.
That's an awesome recommendation for this section, then, to create that kind of program or legislation.
Yep, I like that idea. Should that go under access?
Well, I think it could be under awareness, if we're just talking about creating a product to share with the public that provides this information.
I think, yeah, the website kind of the GIS product is awareness. The creating legislation to provide access or use might be under the access part.
Correct.
Okay. Continuing on with the last one. This is one we had from the emails talking about safety, and we added it in under awareness about continuing updating boater safety. I know that we do have some brochures and stuff like that on boater safety, but we could definitely always do better. And if we're going to put in here about possible iPhone updating awareness on where to go, we can also add safety measures to that also.
Boater safety is a pretty broad topic in my mind. I mean, are we talking about when do you have to turn a light on, you know, after dark on your boat, or are we talking about, you know, avoiding dams, or are we talking, you know, is it all the above? Or?
The comment that we received was in particular to low head dams, but we didn't want to, just because the brochures and the website, it's all really dated. So we didn't want to pigeonhole ourselves by just focusing on dams. We thought it would be good just to have all the brochures and content online kind of updated on a continual basis.
Yeah. Seth, that's actually a good point. Something simple that, you know, if you're creating that GIS site for boating access, you could also list the location of low-head dams. And if you have a product like that that's online, you can easily create links to boater safety. This is what you have to have on your boat at all time, and these are the night navigational information, and here's a link for this, and just kind of providing that, incorporating that into, you know, the iFishing website or something like that would be easy to do. But dams could be easily incorporated into that GIS product.
Do we, so a while back, we had the Public Safety at Dams Act or something. We tried to create an ad rule that had restricted boating zones. You know, so many feet above a low-head dam was restricted, so many feet below a low-head, you know, dam was restricted, and have signage and buoys accordingly. That got shot down in JCAR. Do we try to re-engage something to that effect?
Well, I mean, you could still add a warning area on a GIS map that has that, that's not legislatively restricted, but this is a warning area that you should stay out of.
Yeah.
And that would just be a good public outreach initiative or task. But yeah, I see going back to JCAR or trying to pass some kind of legislative requirement saying that you have to stay so far away would be a completely different task.
You know, I wonder if you could also link the discharge data, if we're talking about cool apps, link the discharge data to, in real time to this app that we're discussing, and suggest under certain flow conditions that navigation may be hazardous. You know, we had some people that went out and boated on Vermilion River recently, and that turned out very badly for them. And, you know, even though it was announced the river was closed, they either didn't know or didn't care, but if it's a didn't know situation, we could put alerts where flows are, again, hazardous. That doesn't have to have a legal meaning. We can just say, you know, denote a flow condition and say, here or above may be hazardous to navigate.
So you can easily pull in USGS gauges into a ArcGIS map, and you can likely click on it and get information. You would probably just have to append that or add additional information to say, at this stage, things are too low for this boating, at this stage, it's too high.
For safe boating.
For safe boating, or the safe boating ranges from this stage to this stage. There may be legal concern of us saying that.
Yeah, I've been down that road.
So
You can't find
what's safe?
a stage or a flow, because then if somebody dies and they prove that it was 5 CFS lower than what you designated safe boating, now you're liable because you designated that as being safe.
Caution should be used when,
Yeah.
and not using the word. Anyway, that stuff can be worked out in the implementation stage, but know that you can incorporate outside or external data into a GIS map that's owned and operated by someone else.
All right.
Okay, anybody else? Comments? I'd like to thank everybody for their feedback. This has been really good.
Well, thank you guys. Yes, this is great to pull together. I know it's tough, especially you guys and Brian going first and kind of dealing with some of the more general comments that I think is going to apply to everybody. I'm looking at Lauren. We slated for a third topic. It's 11:30, but we had other topic or another discussion piece we wanted to have. I guess I'll throw it to you, Lauren. Do you want me to try and squeeze this in 25 minutes and say, let's not talk about the other stuff? You want to talk about the table and some of the concerns, and we can roll water sustainability into next month. And we may just have to have 4 or maybe in 5 of these instead of having 3.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's maybe take a 5-minute bio break and then come back and talk about, you want to talk about the table instead and defer water sustainability to the next?
Sure. So 11:41, we'll come back and just go over the table and some of the questions and maybe
About a half an hour or something?
Yeah, we'll try and finish up by noon if possible.
Yeah.
We'll try and go through it quickly.
Let's do that.
Is that fine with everybody?
Sounds good.
Okay. 11:41, we'll start back up. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. I assume everybody's kind of making their way back to the presentation. Lauren, did you want to lead this, or do you want me to kind of?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think there was some questions about the table that we wanted to address. I just wanted to have kind of an open discussion, make sure that we're all on the same page. One that came up often and frequent was, do we really need to have long-term and short-term identified in this table as far as for the recommendations table? So I think Brian, if you've kind of pulled this together, and also Seth and Brennan kind of said the same thing, that the long-term and short-term is kind of sometimes not applicable, and it may be better to drop it. So I guess I wanted to get everybody else's feedback and thoughts if there's a need to include long-term versus short-term, or if we just consider dropping that off the table. So
we have I guess I'll start by saying we have a 5-year kind of perspective, right? That we hope that after we reach this point of saying here, General Assembly is an update to this plan, that within the next 5 years, there would be another update, right? And so it's kind of, so as long as if we focus our recommendations on things that would be applicable to this next 5-year period, then we've kind of done that, right? Now, do we get as a study done, in 5 years from now that we may have recommended? Maybe, maybe not, right? But it would still be, I think, so I guess what I'm saying is we don't necessarily need that identification of short-term, long-term, but maybe by just how we're trying to create the update, it kind of provides that 5-year frame of reference to say these are recommendations for this period, right? Because there were a number of other topics and issues that we didn't even really, pull in per se for a spotlight in this update that, that maybe in the next 5-year plan, they will be, pulled in there. So I think we don't need to identify it necessarily short-term, long-term, but just have an appreciation for that 5-year window.
Is there any other comments or concerns? So I guess we're at this point kind of proposing dropping that short-term, long-term designation and focusing just on what would be short-term recommendations.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Maybe just in the very rare case that maybe, we're very cognizant that something's going to take longer than that maybe kind of imply that that the recommendation is like the first phase in a longer process, and that could be just put very briefly in the recommendation itself. But yeah, I think it's good.
I mean, we could initiate, right? The word initiate gives us a lot of play there, that in this 5-year period, we would initiate something that could take much longer.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Any other comments or thoughts on that? Okay, hearing none, just kind of looking at the table, I assumed everybody's kind of good with the issue and recommendations column in the table. It may be best to number the recommendation like 1A and 1B. Is that maybe a good way to clarify? I'm trying to think if we have like if we want to reference this later, do we want to just reference it 1A, 1B, kind of as shown on the screen now for simplicity's sake? As we try and maybe reference.
Is there an advantage to, after we've finalized our recommendations, to just numbering them, right? So that, and if this is, the 3rd chapter or something, maybe we're at recommendation number 27, 28, 29, you know, and so is there a benefit to having a specific number to a recommendation for the entire plan?
Well,
Otherwise we end up with 13 1As.
Well, here's the other option, is that we have 13 topics. You know, if aquatic habitat is one, I know it's not, but say if it's one or 7, then their recommendations would be 7A, 7B, 7C, and not worry about numbering the issues, because we don't identify the issues by number up above in the issue section. Do we just have the recommendation be the topic number plus whatever letter? So, Brian, I forget what number aquatic habitat is. I don't have the list in front of me. But, you know, assuming it's like 7, you would have 7A, 7B, and they just count down all the way through. Does anybody have any thoughts on preference one way or another?
The other way of doing that same thing, but not doing it really numerically, is just to abbreviate the critical issue. So, for instance, you know, if we were on the water quality critical issue, the recommendation would be WQ1A. And so each critical issue then has a, you know, 2 or 3 letter designation then that can be easily referenced at the bottom of the table or something like that.
So that's, it may be easier to identify what 4 is, and maybe...
Because 4 doesn't mean anything unless you go back to the chapter, you know, to the index and say, okay, which one is 4? Oh, yes, that's water quality. But WQ is a little easy to...
Yeah, that one.
You know, AH for aquatic habitat or something like that.
I kind of like that. We could, you know, it could be 2 to 4 letters or something like that, but and then making sure that in each of the sections in the write-up that you indicate what that abbreviation is several times throughout the document, and then it makes it easier for people to then just suddenly gravitate to that.
Yeah, like rec 1, 2, 3, nav 1, 2, 3.
So then, Brian, would we get rid of the number 1 by the degraded, like the issues won't be numbered, but the recommendations would all be numbered?
Right.
Because that's where it's getting a little confusing, because I'm like you, I have issues that have many subtopics, but then,
Or you could...
Seth did not. They just had, you know, 1 per, and this would be, you know, theirs, we don't number the issues. They have an issue with each recommendation.
I was actually thinking keep the numbers for the issue. But like, so the way that I thought about it is, you know, invasive species, okay, so
Oh, sorry.
degraded aquatic habitat is 1.
So that would
And then for the
actually be
recommendation-
AQ1 would be the issue, and AQA would be...
Well, so I was thinking, you know, 1 for the issue, and then for the recommendations, A, B, C, D, you know, remove the 1. So then you could do, yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So like that, then it would be 1A is the recommendation. 1B is the recommendation. If you just wanted to do, you know. So that's where my mind was going in terms of organizing this.
So then whenever you get to the next issue, it'd be AQ1, and then it'd start the lettering again, A, B, C, D?
Yeah, AQ2, you mean? Yeah.
Or AQ, yeah.
Yeah.
But then if you were going to refer to it, you would actually refer to it as AQ.2.C.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, that's getting convoluted in my mind.
I guess that's why I was leaning toward.
I mean, here's another option. Do we delete the issue off the table? Since we don't clearly identify them up above?
And we would have this table with each issue, right? And then maybe a master one at the end or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the issues though, because it helps my brain. If I get a list of 20 recommendations, it just becomes a mess, but this subcategory helps me,
Yeah,
my brain. But I don't know if we have to number the issues.
No.
I think we just get rid of that.
The issues are the
It's
issues.
there, but here you would do the AQ1 or ABC, and you would just keep continuing. If this was AQE, this becomes F, G, and you just, all of them are AQ, A through Z. Or do you not want the AQ anymore?
The only reason that you don't have to put the AQ in the chapter table.
No, no.
The only place that you put it is when you're referencing. So this could be 1 through 20, just straight down.
Oh, so you want
But
to
then if you're
number,
in
not the,
Yeah, if you're in a different table somewhere else in the document, then you would have to designate it some way that this one is associated with aquatic habitat, not water quality, or something like that.
yeah. And that reduces it. It's just AQ 1 through 20. That's a much easier than, so it would be AQ 1. You don't even need periods, you don't need anything.
But you'd only use that designation,
Right.
the letter designation, if it was somewhere else in the document.
Right, not
You don't
in
need to do it
here.
throughout this chapter.
And this would be specific and say, well, I mean, we won't say AQ, but this is AQ as a reminder. Or AA.
Yeah, I actually would put that in the table name, because then whenever we have our, list of tables, it will pop up as AQ issues and recommendations.
I said AQ, it's AH or WQ. There is no AQ.
Any thoughts from, anybody else? Any preferences, thoughts?
Well, I'm looking at the Illinois River Integrated Management Plan, and they did kind of what Lauren said, that, that they just sequentially just gave them all numbers, but then they have like a table of contents or something that kind of showed that, in the corridor objective was recommendations 1 through 6, and stormwater movement was 7 through 13. But but I think maybe that preface, maybe keeping it, maybe a combination of having, well, we were saying AQ for the habitat thing, the aquatic habitat. Let's say AQ is, 1 through 20, and then water sustainability, WS or something is 21 through 32, but then the recommendations are all sequential, so it'll get a long list, but then that preface tells you, well, what topic is it addressing at the same time, and then when people get into longer discussion, you can just refer to, recommendation, 40. To make it easier to talk about.
I like just having a unique number, just 1 through 100 or whatever of our recommendations. So we can talk about recommendation 38.
Of course, that makes a lot more work for Wes when this document is put all together and we can go through the number and everything.
As long as we're not referencing it in the text.
Well, I was gonna say, when you write a multi-topic or section report, the numbering becomes really problematic for the writer, to correlate, or if someone adds one at the last minute and changes. It's sort of a nightmare to keep renumbering everything. Ideally, we're all set in stone before we number, but things change, and then your references, like you said, every time you reference, I feel like the AH 1 through 20 is gonna be easier to renumber than, I don't know, 300 recommendations. But you guys have seen more of these reports. I'm thinking as the writer.
So I think as the writer, the abbreviations is easier, but as we move to implementation and we're discussing recommendation 28 is easier than saying recommendation AH3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see the benefit is that we'll spend most of our time probably referencing these after the report then.
Yeah.
So with that,
For now, I think just go with a numerical.
and we can get feedback, and it may change once we get further down the road, but let's just assume everybody can number their own section 1 through whatever and know that they may be, the numbering will potentially change.
Yeah.
So then the next question I'm going to lead to, I think everybody's good with the lead agency column, unless there's any concerns, but we talked about adding supporting agencies. I think that just confuses things. The lead agency is just kind of it's more of a point of contact.
Yeah.
And I mean, we could specify for those agencies who have multiple offices, such as DNR, maybe we also list the office name.
I thought about that, but then I was like, yeah,
I don't know.
The more you add, the more difficult it becomes, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, who's gonna take low flow, right?
Yeah.
That's your shop, that's our shop, that's, you know, it's recreation, you just, I think DNR.
I suggest they take it.
There we go.
So we'll just leave it as DNR then. The funding and action is the two that I think that need the most clarification and guidance on. You know, even just looking between Brian and Brennan's presentation, you see they're kind of done a different way. You throw up mine, I think I even did it a different way. So we wanted some level of consistency between all the different tables. So I guess I'll kind of open up for discussion. I wonder if this should be a single payment or a single line item, or if it's a continual annual funding or none, if we should designate in that way. And I'd also, I guess, maybe propose that we may need to include a dollar number there. I know that it's a shot from the hip, but I think if a legislator's looking at whether or not he wants to move forward, he may want to know, he or she, may want to know how much that dollar amount is estimated to be. So I guess to start the conversation, I'll say that I would recommend a annual, a one-time, or a none, and then the dollar amount in that column. Any thoughts, concerns with doing it that way?
I would add continuous.
Well, that would be annual, correct?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right.
and so expansion of current funding would just be, again, that would fall under annual, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
enhance versus extend, I mean, most of them, we talked about this in the past, are we just keeping it as is? Most of the time, we want more. So it's almost like enhanced annual funding. We don't want what we have today.
I mean, you could say enhanced and show the total amount, and then in parentheses, you could say existing is X amount. If you wanted to add that clarification.
Some of that's unknown, though. You know, I think it's like if we wanted to say something about dam removal program or something. Sometimes, I don't know, your other programs get this, but, you know, we might get $30 million and it's like you get that until you spend through it and then come ask for more. Well, is that, we spend it a year, 5 years, 2, you know, and so it's tough to.
Yeah, but we could estimate that we go through 4 dam removals a year at $2 to $3 million a piece. We need $10 million a year. I mean, it's just a ballpark starting point, I think. I don't know. That's why I would preface it that way, but I'm not.
I don't mind, you know, categorizing everything as annual, one time, or none, but I am really hesitant to put a dollar amount on it. And part of that is, even if I can ballpark it, the amount of research some of these would take to identify a relevant dollar amount is going to be hugely time consuming.
Well, we're going to need to do that in the next 5 years anyways to implement it. So it's when do we take the time to find out how much it's going to cost?
There's a big risk at over or underestimating the cost dramatically, though. Underestimating the risk is you go forward and you say, I need X amount, it's twice that much, and then, you know, you take a lot of flack for that, or then it's no longer palatable. Overestimating it may take it off the table as something that someone wants to take up as a, you know, legislative initiative or something like that.
I wonder if we could just do almost like a small, medium, large.
That's what, my mind was going there too, yeah.
Almost I mean, I don't know, because I have heard if a legislator sees a number, that's the first number they see is what they will remember for the rest of their lives. And if you change it, doesn't matter, but that's what you're gonna get.
Yeah, but that's what they're gonna ask for. They're gonna ask for it.
That becomes more.
As soon as they see this, they're gonna ask for the dollar amount, is my opinion.
That's fine. Yeah. In fact, that's what the plan should do. We want to follow, we're going to take a lead on implementing this. What dollar amount? Do we have a low, medium, high, and define a range of, you know, low is under 100,000, medium,
Don't do that, because you're in the same category then. If you go above or below, you said this would be under 100. Either give a cost or you don't.
I think we leave it off, in my thought.
Any other opinions on showing a cost versus not a cost?
I mean, one option in the report is to say, to fund us to determine those costs. Like State Water Plan Part B is actual funding for us to spend time calculating those, but.
That's we need a report to do a report?
I don't know.
Says the former consultant, yeah. I just think that when we go to implementation of that, that's when it would get.
Yeah, I know the former report did list costs, but we're not down to that. My preference would be to show a cost because it's going to be the first question, but I'm willing to, I have no problem if we don't want to do that. So.
I understand, Wes, that, you know, the desire, and I you know, yeah, they're going to need costs. But I kind of agree with Brian, though. I mean, the previous planning committee had 4 years.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of time that goes into these costs.
Well, what happens if we just add another 6 months to the calendar for ag costs? Because we're going to have to do it either today or tomorrow, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, you're correct, yeah.
I don't know if it's time so much as the funding for someone to do it. And what Laura said last time was there were groups that were funded to do the State Water Plan last time. And like their groups, they have to have allocated funding to allow someone to work on that task. I don't know.
I think from a plan perspective, to me, funding was almost a yes, no. You know, does this recommendation require funding? Right, is GOMB going to be involved, or are we talking about merely a programmatic kind of policy change that is how existing staff is going to do something? So it's not a change of funding, adding the Wes's idea of annual, you know, one time or what the other one.
Or none.
Or none. That to me, for a plan, gives a good, yes, but annual funding is going to be required. Okay, well then that lets whoever was reading that on that recommendation number 27 know that we got to head into a dollar discussion.
Well, I think one thing we could try to do some back of the envelope stuff, but I think towards the end of our collaboration, our topic collaboration process, where we find that we may have several recommendations that cross-cut topics, that where you can probably show some efficiency in saying, see, you know, we can accomplish a lot more, you know, for these dollars, you know, with these, you know, many birds, one stone type of thing. And so, you know, that's going to look well as too. So I don't know whether, at least for now, that we all are mindful of seeing what we could put together and as time goes on, see how close we can get into refining something and then add where we can? Because Wes is right, we're gonna need to, some estimate. It's just, how can we can give ranges maybe? But,
Well, to me, that almost gets into implementation, whether that becomes, again, part of the plan, or, you know, the task force is gonna do X, Y, and Z on recommendation number 27, you know, and that we would get into some of those kinds of details, and, you know, we can combine dam removal and fish enhancement and stream gauge funds all in the same action, you know.
Yeah, I can see the benefit, because unless we did in the cross-cutting table where we know we're gonna do multiple recommendations in one cross-cutting item, where we're developing a GIS map that includes this information, that information, this information, that's where you really see, well, doing them separately would cost more than doing them all together, so. But, yeah, I kind of agree that because we don't know what's being implemented, we may not have a good idea of what that cost would be.
Let's go with Wes's suggestion of the, you know, annual, none, one time
Okay.
for that table.
So we don't have to identify the funding source. So it's kind of more like what Brian has shown here. It would be none, annual, or one time. So very similar. And we'll just have it be that simple and not include any other information. The next one would be the actions. I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to go too much later into lunch or past 12 than we need to, but I think this is important just as we're kind of all pulling this together. So action, I've seen policy, legislation, program, and that's where I've kind of led, I guess, start off with that this is either going to be a program issue, something we implement as a program. It could be legislation. And we can debate if you want to call that legislation or policy. And then it could be research/study. We could use either one of those words as well. Is there anything that I'm missing? But I think most of them kind of fall in one of those three categories. It's an easy way to kind of see what is being done. I guess I'll open it up to.
Could we have a project? Would there be a?
So give me an example where it would be a project.
Creation of the invasive species education center.
That sounds like a strategy, not an objective. Right, or not?
Well, I think they were gonna add that one as
Yeah,
a
it's the objective to create that, how and where.
Okay, well, we can add project.
Maybe,
Yeah.
or maybe strategy is the, well, no, we're not getting the strategy, let's just add the project.
Okay, so I guess policy versus legislation, should we keep it as, or should we have either?
I think it's separate.
Yeah, I think policy is valid still. If that allows you, I mean, when I think legislation, I think of law and statutes.
Right.
When I think policy, I think anything from admin rules to just a change in how you,
Right.
you know, work
Policy
as
and
a unit.
procedures manual.
Yeah, so those are, you know, that policy is much lower level perhaps than legislative.
Yeah. Can we pick either research or study? It seems like they're pretty, I think all research is a study. Most studies are research, maybe,
Well, I think of study as being a report,
yeah.
so, but research is long-term, so.
Well, research may not be long-term, and usually research has some kind of report that goes along with it.
Okay.
Let's just call it research.
Yeah, I don't think they differ enough, that somebody is gonna think two different things, so
No.
pick one and go with it.
All right, I'll just say study.
What if I'm asking for a grant? I guess that would just be it would be annual or one time, or I just specify grant in my recommendation, but is that
Well, I assume that's part of the program, that whoever's running that program is seeking a grant?
okay, so it would go program, and then it would be, if it's annual, I want annual grant.
If
Okay.
it's an
I
annual
just want to make
grant
sure
or
everything
one
I
time.
I had thought
fit
about
somewhere.
grants, and I had thought about grants, and that kind of dropped down menu as well, but I really,
Well, grant is just another way of asking for funding, though.
Yeah.
right, it's a source, not a.
It's a source, it's not a,
Different, it's of course a different color in that, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Any other thoughts about action? So right now, we have it as program, policy, legislation, study, and project. Now, I'll send this all out as a summary later this week, once we are set on things, but is everybody good with that? Anybody want to make any other recommendations?
Might be as we go through our sections, people could maybe reach out
Right.
to you and see if it fits under one of these or not.
I'll assume that, somewhere in the introductory material, you're right, that you'll at least provide some sort of basic definition of these for the readers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, somebody from outside may not know what we refer to as program. I have
Yeah.
a pretty good idea, because we refer to program activities all the time, so
Right.
that
Yep.
would be foreign to someone else.
Yep.
Now, what's the only other thing, I know we're trying to leave, but how do we want to show cross-cutting? I know we're gonna have the big table eventually, but at one point we talked about asterisking, but it could be a long list. Are we gonna make a column, or are we just gonna put at the end of our recommendation in parentheses, see also, you know, water quality?
I don't know if it needs to be in this table, if we're gonna create a new table specifically showing cross-cutting.
But we talked about how someone might just read this section, and they might not even read
What
the
if we just,
cross-cutting summary.
in my mind, I was just asterisking those, you know, with the recommendation to have an asterisk, and the asterisk meant relates to a cross-cutting issue.
We don't have to say which one or explain it below.
Not in
Okay.
that chapter.
Yeah, because I saw someone had put that here, cross-cutting and, you
Right.
know, bold or.
Does that provide any additional information, though? Just to say that it is cross-cutting, many of these will be cross-cutting. I would say
Yeah,
the
I
vast
like the
majority.
reference myself, so that I could go read that next section if I
So
wanted
there's,
to.
and there's two ways of doing that. One is, you know, we could very easily put parentheses in the back and number every recommendation or even the chapter that it cross-cuts with. But I think the simplest solution is the easiest one here. You know, the most straightforward is if we're gonna have a table or a figure or something like that that shows the relationship between these chapters, we use that. I just think, you know, we have designed this, I think, from the beginning to not necessarily, I won't use the word standalone chapters, but we have the at least understanding or the perception that people will have focal chapters that they will go to this document for. If they're interested in the cross-cutting or how these relate to each other, there will be a place where they can look at that information.
And I can work on drafting what a table, cross-cutting table would look like. I don't think we need asterisks in here. I think that's something that we create the table, and then we can come back and add an asterisk and footnote that they're cross-cutting topics, because who knows what may come up and may change.
Right.
So,
Let's start with that.
okay. Any other final comments, questions? Is
I
there
think this
any?
was really helpful. just listening to everybody and this collaboration. I
Yes.
learned a lot.
Yeah, this was great.
Our next meeting is in September. I want to say it's the 10th. I don't have 8th.
Wednesday, September 8th.
I will cover water sustainability. Is there any other individuals willing to step up and share their topic? Well, I guess we'll shoot for 3, and knowing that the 3rd, I guess, could potentially get rolled to the next week.
We'll be faster, though, now that we've settled something.
Yeah.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. I think you should shoot for 4, but, we'll try to have ours ready, Wes.
Okay, so flood mitigation. Anybody else?
I can do the integrated water.
Integrated water. Do we want to have a 4th on standby?
Oh, these seem pretty meaty as it is. We got the biggest comments for the flood mitigation.
Okay, well, I guess we will hold 3. If somebody wants to send me something as a potential 4th, just in case, we can, but I don't think we want to go as long as we did today, or try and wrap it up at noon next time. Lauren, you have any closing thoughts, comments?
No, I think we just continue the process. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and we'll continue to engage this way, and that together as a task force, we're fine. I guess one comment I'll make quick in closing is that we did get, a memo or something, or an email that there is now a governor's office of equity or something to that effect. I have started the process. I've reached out to DNR leadership and basically said, how do we engage this office, right? How do we, for our next outreach, how do we do this right or with some guidance so that we're not out there on our own and that we don't end up with some sort of a complaint or action because we didn't do enough or this, that, or the other. So just as an FYI, and maybe I'll have more information to update later, but I am exploring how we connect to get some state guidance on how we do that from a, social, environmental, and diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. So we're making that a specific point of the water plan, so we should probably also do that in our outreach and engagement that we're doing that. So I've had pushback in other areas of our, of my job related to outreach, and so it is a possibility. It's out there. We will hear about it if somebody doesn't like the way we're doing it. So trying to get some guidance. So just an FYI for everybody at this point. That's it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.